My name is Anna. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked behind the scenes, building processes, protecting relationships, and making sure other people's promises were kept. If you passed me in a hallway, you might not remember me 5 minutes later. I've been told I have a calm face, a soft voice, the kind of presence people confuse with compliance. People usually assume I'm agreeable, easy to manage, someone who won't push back if the room gets uncomfortable. And for a long time, I let them believe that. Not because I was afraid, but because I was observant. I learned early that when you're underestimated, you're allowed to see things others miss. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. It's about a moment when a line appeared in front of me, quietly, without drama, and I had to decide whether to step over it. My manager asked me to lie to a client, but I refused. What it doesn't say is everything that happened before and everything that happened after in the long silence that followed that decision. What you're about to hear is not a fast story. It unfolds the way real ethical choices do, slowly, in fragments, through meetings that seem ordinary at the time. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no shouting matches in conference rooms, just small requests, reasonable on the surface, justifications that sound practical, and a growing pressure to be flexible, to be a team player, to smooth over something that didn't feel smooth inside me. I'm telling this in my own voice because too often these moments are rewritten later by people with more power, louder voices, or better narratives. This is my record of how it actually felt. From the inside, the hesitation, the calculation, the cost. You won't hear me claim moral superiority. I made choices, and I paid for them. Integrity has a cost. Sometimes it's immediate. Sometimes it shows up months later in ways you didn't predict. This story traces that cost honestly, what it took from me and what it quietly gave back. If you're expecting a dramatic confrontation, you won't find it here. The most important shifts in this story happen internally, in moments when no one else was watching, moments where silence could have been easier, cheaper, safer. I'm sharing this because many of us have been in rooms where the wrong thing was framed as just how it works, where saying no felt disproportionate to the request, where the consequences of refusing weren't spelled out, but somehow everyone knew they were real. As you listen, you might recognize pieces of your own experience, times you stayed quiet or times you didn't. There's no judgment in that recognition, only curiosity. So before we go any further, I want to ask you, gently and honestly, have you ever felt the weight of a decision before anyone else knew it existed? Before anything went wrong, I need you to understand who I was in that environment. Not who I am now, but who they believed I was. At work, I was described with words like reliable, steady, and low maintenance. Compliments that sound positive until you realize they're rarely followed by promotions or protection. I was the person copied on emails just in case, the one asked to take notes, to follow up, to smooth things over when someone else forgot. I didn't interrupt meetings. I didn't compete for airtime. When decisions were made, they often happened around me, not with me. And I made that easy. I dressed simply, neutral colors, nothing that drew attention or invited comment. I spoke when I had something precise to add, and I stopped when I was done. I learned early that being concise made people comfortable. It also made me forgettable. My manager once told me, half joking, "I never worry about you." At the time, I took it as praise. Now I understand what he meant. I wasn't a variable. I didn't surprise anyone. I fit neatly into the mental box they had built for me. What they didn't see was how much I noticed. I noticed who spoke with certainty and who spoke with evidence, who deflected responsibility upward and who absorbed it quietly. I noticed how certain people were forgiven for mistakes framed as ambition, while others were corrected for the same behavior, framed as overstepping. I was rarely corrected because I rarely stepped anywhere visible. In group settings, I was the one people talked over, not aggressively, not maliciously, just instinctively. My sentences sometimes trailed off, not because I had nothing to say, but because the room had already moved on. I learned to finish my thoughts internally, to store them, to wait. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't hurt at first. It feels like safety, like you're spared the friction others endure. No one challenges you because no one feels challenged by you. That was me. Clients liked me, not in a memorable way, but in a reassuring one. I followed through. I answered emails thoroughly. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. When something went wrong, I explained it clearly and took responsibility, even when it wasn't fully mine. Inside the company, that translated to trust, but not influence. If someone needed something done correctly, I was the choice. If someone needed something decided, I wasn't in the room. I don't say this with resentment. At the time, I believed this was the trade off. Visibility came with risk, noise came with consequences. I thought I was choosing peace. What I didn't realize was that by being consistently dependable, I was also being quietly assigned a role, the role of the person who would adapt, who would absorb the inconvenience, who would do what was necessary to keep things moving, even if necessary was vaguely defined. No one ever told me this explicitly. Roles like that are never announced. They emerge through repetition, through whom is asked and who is not, through whom is information shared after decisions are made rather than before. I was informed, often. When deadlines were tight, I was looped in late and expected to catch up fast. When processes changed, I was trusted to adjust without complaint. When something needed explaining to a client in careful language, that task found its way to me. "You're good with words," they'd say. "You're level headed." Level headed is another word that sounds kind, until you realize it often means you won't make this harder for us. At that stage, I didn't resist any of it. I believed competence would eventually speak for itself. That consistency would accumulate into something undeniable. I didn't yet understand that being underestimated isn't neutral, it's directional. It points somewhere, toward what people think they can ask of you. And at that point in the story, they thought they could ask me for anything. I just didn't know it yet. The first moment that stayed with me didn't announce itself as important. It rarely does. It was small enough to be dismissed, polite enough to ignore, and quiet enough that no one else seemed to register it at all. It happened in a routine meeting, one of those weekly check-ins where nothing significant is supposed to change. Updates, timelines, light commentary. I had spent the previous evening reviewing a client file because something in the numbers didn't align. It wasn't dramatic, just a discrepancy that, if left unaddressed, could turn into confusion later. When my turn came, I explained it calmly. I even framed it gently, as a question rather than a correction. My manager nodded once, distracted. Then he moved on. A few minutes later, someone else, higher up, louder, more confident, raised the same concern, almost word for word. This time, the room paused. Heads turned. My manager leaned forward. "That's a good catch," he said. I remember the exact feeling in my chest. Not anger, not embarrassment, just a brief, hollow awareness. Like realizing you'd been speaking into a muted microphone. No one looked at me. No one acknowledged the repetition. And I didn't interrupt to clarify. I told myself it didn't matter. The issue was addressed. The outcome was what counted. That's what I believed then. Later that day, my manager stopped by my desk. He said, "Thanks for flagging that earlier. Next time, try to be more concise." I thanked him. That was the cut, not the credit, not even the dismissal. It was the subtle repositioning of responsibility without recognition. The suggestion that the issue wasn't being ignored. It was just being delivered incorrectly when it came from me. I didn't argue. I replayed the moment instead. Wondered if my tone had been off, if I had been too careful, too soft. I adjusted my notes for the next meeting. Shorter sentences, clearer bullets. I told myself this was growth, but something had shifted. A small awareness took root. I started noticing how often this pattern repeated, not just with me, but around me. Ideas didn't belong to the person who first thought them. They belonged to the person the room was ready to hear, and the room, I was learning, wasn't ready for me. Still, I stayed quiet. I didn't mark the moment. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not friends, not colleagues. It didn't feel serious enough. Complaining would have felt excessive. So I normalized it. I told myself I was lucky. I had job security, respect, even if it was understated. I wasn't being mistreated. I wasn't being yelled at or excluded. I was included, just not centered. That distinction matters more than people think. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. My suggestions were acknowledged indirectly. My work was referenced without my name. My role subtly narrowed to execution rather than thought. Each time, I smoothed it over internally. I told myself this was how teams worked. Someone had to be the steady one. Someone had to care more about accuracy than applause. And I was good at that. But the first small cut had done its work. It had taught me something important. Silence wasn't neutral, it was instructional. It showed people how far they could go without pushback. They were learning, and so was I. What's dangerous about subtle disrespect is how easily it blends into routine. It doesn't arrive as a confrontation, it arrives as a pattern. By the time I noticed it clearly, it already felt familiar. Meetings began to follow a rhythm. I'd prepare, I'd listen, I'd speak carefully, and then the room would move on. Sometimes my points would resurface later, reframed by someone else. Sometimes they wouldn't resurface at all. When they didn't, and the consequence appeared weeks later, no one connected it back to what I tried to say, including me. I started editing myself before I spoke. If an observation felt inconvenient, I'd soften it. If it sounded like disagreement, I'd turn it into a suggestion. I told myself I was being collaborative, mature, strategic. What I was really doing was making myself easier to overlook. My manager developed a habit of summarizing discussions in ways that subtly excluded my contributions. Not intentionally, I don't think, just reflexively. He remembered the loudest voices, the most confident ones, the people who spoke without qualifying themselves. I noticed he rarely interrupted me, not because he was listening, but because he assumed I'd finish quickly. There were moments when I considered pushing back, correcting the record, saying, I actually mentioned that earlier. But every time, I imagined how it would sound defensive, petty, out of proportion. So I stayed silent. Silence became a form of self justification. I told myself I didn't need validation, that my work spoke for itself, that I wasn't there to compete. And that belief became a shield. It protected me from disappointment, but it also kept me from reacting. I absorbed more than I should have. Extra tasks framed as opportunities, tight deadlines presented as tests of trust. I was thanked for my flexibility instead of being consulted about it. When I did raise concerns, they were acknowledged politely and deprioritized efficiently. Let's circle back. Good point, but not right now. I learned which battles weren't worth the energy, and eventually, everything felt like one of those. The most unsettling part was how normal it all felt. I stopped noticing the weight of it because it had become part of the job. Part of my identity is there. I was the dependable one, the reasonable one, the person who wouldn't make things awkward. People like that are rarely feared. They're rarely protected either. At some point, I realized I was being trusted with outcomes, but not with truth. I was told what needed to be done, not why. I was looped in after decisions had already solidified. I was expected to align quickly and communicate smoothly, especially with clients. You're good at explaining things, my manager would say. You know how to keep them calm. Calm became my assigned function, and functions can be repurposed. I don't blame anyone for this. Not fully. Systems encourage it. People slide into roles without noticing the edges hardening around them. I participated. I complied. I told myself this was temporary. But normalization has a cost. It dulls your internal alarms. It teaches you to accept small misalignments because confronting them feels disruptive. By the time the real request came, the one that forced a decision, I had already been trained, slowly and thoroughly, to say yes without needing to be convinced. That's what made it dangerous, because when the moment arrived, it didn't feel shocking. It felt expected. Roles are rarely assigned out loud. No one sits you down and explains the limits of who you're allowed to be. Instead, they show you through repetition, through expectation, through what happens when you comply and what happens when you don't. By that point, my role was clear, even if it had never been named. I was the stabilizer. When things became tense, I was brought in to lower the temperature. When timelines slipped, I was expected to compensate quietly. When a message needed to be delivered carefully, especially to a client, I was the one asked to do it. Not because I had authority, because I had credibility. Clients trusted me. They believed what I said. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't deflect. I answered questions directly. Over time, That reputation solidified into something valuable. I didn't realize how valuable it was until I noticed how often I was being positioned between the truth and the person who deserved it. Information came to me filtered, context was reduced, decisions were framed as fates accompli, and my task was no longer to represent reality. It was to maintain alignment. Just explain it in a way they'll accept, my manager would say. Accept, not understand. That word started to bother me. There were moments when I asked for clarification, when I tried to understand the reasoning behind a change or a delay. Sometimes I received partial answers. Sometimes I was told, it's complicated, or we don't need to get into that. What I was being asked to do was becoming clear, translate discomfort into reassurance, convert uncertainty into confidence, deliver outcomes without exposing the process. And because I had done this well in the past, without complaint, it became my default assignment. I remember one conversation in particular. My manager said, "You're good at this kind of thing. You don't escalate. You don't dramatize." He meant it as praise. I heard it as an instruction. Don't escalate. Don't dramatize. Don't complicate. The role came with an unspoken promise. As long as I stayed within it, I would be trusted. I would be included. I would be safe. But safety built on silence is conditional. I began to feel the narrowing, the sense that there were questions I wasn't supposed to ask, boundaries I wasn't supposed to test. I noticed how quickly discomfort was redirected toward me, how often I was asked to handle something instead of deciding something. Still, I didn't resist. Not openly. I told myself this was professional maturity, that leadership meant absorbing pressure, that not every truth needed to be shared in full. But there's a difference between discretion and distortion, between framing and fabrication. I didn't know yet where the line would be drawn. I only knew that I was being moved closer to it, one reasonable request at a time. The role I was assigned depended on my predictability, on my willingness to smooth over inconsistencies, on my reputation for calm compliance. And as long as I played it well, no one questioned whether I should be asked to do more. That's how roles solidify, not through force, but through trust placed just slightly in the wrong direction. I was about to find out what happens when that trust is tested. The day everything shifted didn't arrive with tension in the air. There was no raised voice, no urgent email flagged in red. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that blurs into dozens of others when you look back. I was reviewing a client update when my manager asked if I had a few minutes. His tone was casual, familiar, the kind of tone that suggests efficiency, not consequence. He closed the door behind him, not dramatically, just habitually, and sat down across from me. He explained that there had been a delay, a mistake upstream, not catastrophic, but inconvenient. The client, he said, didn't need all the details. What we need, he said, is to buy a little time. He suggested a version of events, carefully worded, technically incomplete. It would imply progress that hadn't actually happened yet. Not a lie, he said, just strategic framing. I listened without interrupting. I asked a few clarifying questions. How long would the delay be? What exactly had been communicated already? His answers were vague, flexible. He emphasized tone over content. As he spoke, something quiet happened inside me. It wasn't outrage, it wasn't fear, it was recognition. I realized that this wasn't about communication, it was about consent. He wasn't just asking me to deliver a message, he was asking me to stand behind it, to lend my credibility to something I couldn't fully defend. And in that moment, I saw the line. I didn't argue, I didn't lecture. I simply said, I'm not comfortable saying that. The room went still, not tense, but surprised. He looked at me like he was recalibrating, like a tool had responded in an unexpected way. It's not a big deal, he said. We do this all the time. That was the second shift, because I realized then that this wasn't an exception. It was a pattern I'd been protected from by omission. And now I was being invited into it, not as an observer, but as a participant. I repeated myself calmly. I can explain the delay. I can take responsibility for the next steps. But I won't imply something that isn't true. There was a pause. He nodded slowly, as if weighing something. We'll talk later, he said. After he left, I sat at my desk and stared at my screen. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel anxious. I felt clear. Something fundamental had shifted, not in the company, but in me. I understood, with surprising certainty, that there was no version of this job that required me to trade my integrity quietly. And I also understood that clarity comes with consequences. I went back to work, answered emails, completed tasks. From the outside, nothing had changed, but internally, a door had closed. I had seen the line, and I had chosen not to cross it. And even though no one else knew it yet, I knew that choice would not be invisible for long. After that conversation, no one said anything directly. There was no follow-up meeting, no written warning, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. That's how I knew it mattered. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was observant. My manager became more careful around me. Not colder, just precise. Instructions arrived more clearly bound, fewer assumptions, fewer you know what I mean moments. He stopped asking me to handle sensitive messages and began assigning them elsewhere. At first, that felt like relief. Then I noticed something else. I was being excluded from certain conversations. Subtly. Calendars filled without my name. Decisions were finalized before reaching me. The trust that once flowed freely toward me had been rerouted. And still, no one confronted me. I didn't confront them either. This was the moment when silence stopped being passive. It became deliberate. I could have explained myself further, justified my refusal, reassured them that I was still a team player, that this was a one-time boundary. But I didn't, because I realized that explanations invite negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating, so I worked carefully, precisely. I documented everything. I followed processes to the letter. I communicated clearly, in writing, with neutral language and complete context. I stopped filling in gaps for other people. When information was missing, I asked for it. When instructions were unclear, I requested clarification. When timelines were unrealistic, I stated that plainly, without apology. Not loudly, not emotionally, just accurately. People began to misinterpret my calm as distance. My restraint is detachment. I could feel the narrative shifting around me. I was no longer the easy one. I was becoming inconvenient. And inconvenience, in systems built on quiet compliance, is often mistaken for disloyalty. Still, I said nothing because I was watching. I paid attention to what changed when I stopped absorbing uncertainty. How often have problems escalated without me smoothing them over? how visible certain inconsistencies became when they weren't translated into reassurance. I realized something important during this period. Silence can be a refusal, but it can also be a mirror. By stepping back, I wasn't withdrawing value. I was allowing reality to present itself without my intervention. Others mistook this for weakness, for disengagement, for someone quietly checking out. They didn't realize I was choosing my silence carefully. Because the more I observed, the clearer it became that what I had refused wasn't an isolated request. It was part of a larger structure, one that depended on people like me to make it function without friction. And once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. I didn't yet know what I would do with that knowledge. I only knew that reacting impulsively would cost me the leverage I hadn't finished understanding. So I stayed calm, professional, silent, and I let them underestimate what that silence meant. What they never noticed was how much room their assumptions gave me. They saw my quiet as withdrawal, as someone pulling back emotionally, doing only what was required. They assumed I was protecting myself, maybe even preparing to leave. That assumption was comforting to them. It meant nothing had to change. What they didn't see was how methodical I had become. I started keeping records, not out of paranoia, but out of clarity. I documented timelines, saved emails, noted when instructions changed, when expectations shifted without explanation, and when responsibility was reassigned after the fact. I wasn't building a case yet. I was building understanding. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped cushioning them. I noticed how often decisions were made verbally, then softened or rewritten in writing later. How accountability blurred as information moved upward. How clients were kept calm with partial truths, and how often I had been the conduit for that calm. I began to learn the system as it actually functioned, not as it was described in onboarding documents or mission statements. At the same time, I invested in myself quietly. I updated my credentials, took courses at night, reconnected with former colleagues, not to complain, but to listen. I asked careful questions about how other organizations handle transparency, escalation, and responsibility. No one knew I was doing this. There was no announcement, no signal. That was intentional. I also reviewed my own work with new eyes. I looked at how often my name appeared behind successful outcomes without being associated with the decision-making process. I realized how much institutional knowledge I held, knowledge that wasn't written down anywhere else. And I stopped sharing it freely, not to punish anyone, but to observe what happened when I wasn't quietly compensating for gaps. Things slowed, confusion surfaced, questions went unanswered longer than usual. No one connected that shift to me. They never do. What they also didn't notice was how my refusal had changed the internal balance. By saying no once and then not over explaining, I had stepped outside the role they'd assigned me. And without that role, certain expectations began to wobble. I wasn't confrontational. I wasn't disengaged. I was precise. And precision has a way of exposing fragility. During this time, I discovered something that surprised me. I wasn't angry. I felt focused, calm, almost detached. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was trying to see clearly. And what I saw was leverage, not in the dramatic sense, but in the structural one. I understood where trust flowed, where credibility is pooled, where risk accumulated quietly. masked by routine. I hadn't created that leverage. They had. By depending on me without fully acknowledging me, they had concentrated something fragile in one place. And by underestimating my response, they had assumed I wouldn't recognize it. They were wrong. I didn't rush. I haven't acted yet. Preparation doesn't announce itself, it just continues. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no moment where everything suddenly clicked into place. It arrived quietly, like most truths do, after you've already gathered all the pieces and finally allow yourself to assemble them. I was reviewing a set of documents late one evening. Nothing urgent, just unfinished threads I hadn't been able to let go of. As I cross checked timelines, emails, and deliverables, I noticed something that had been hiding in plain sight. The story being told to clients didn't just differ from reality in tone. In a few key places, it diverged in substance. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarms on its own, but enough that if anyone ever compared records closely, the inconsistencies would raise questions. Questions about process, about accountability, about who knew what and when. And suddenly, I understood why credibility mattered so much in my role. I had been the constant, the steady voice, the person whose words clients trusted because they matched outcomes most of the time. That trust had been used as ballast, stabilizing narratives that were flexible. This wasn't corruption, it was normalization. The kind that grows slowly inside organizations that prioritize momentum over accuracy. No one wakes up intending to deceive. They just get used to smoothing edges until the shape no longer matches the truth. What made this a reveal wasn't the discovery itself. I realized where I stood in relation to it. If something ever went wrong, truly wrong, the records would show that I was the one communicating, explaining, reassuring. On paper, I would look complicit, not because I had made decisions, but because I had carried them. That was the clarity. I sat back and felt an unexpected calm, not fear, not urgency, just a sober understanding of risk. I also saw something else. My refusal hadn't isolated me, it had protected me. By stepping back when I did, by insisting on accuracy, by moving communication into written, traceable channels, I had created distance between myself and a system that relied on ambiguity. The leverage wasn't about exposing anyone, it was about choice. I now knew I had options, and that not all of them were reversible. I could stay quiet and continue to insulate myself, letting the system run until it corrected itself or collapsed. I could escalate internally, knowing that doing so would likely frame me as disruptive. Or I could remove myself carefully, on my own terms, before the cost of staying grew heavier. What I didn't feel was triumph. There's no satisfaction in realizing you've been standing closer to the fault line than you thought. Only responsibility. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a while. I thought about the client, the real people behind the contracts. I thought about my younger self, who had believed that competence alone was enough. And I thought about the version of me they still assumed I was, the one who would smooth things over. That version was gone. And once you see clearly, you don't celebrate, you decide. There is a moment when you understand the full shape of a situation, where inaction becomes a decision of its own. That was where I found myself. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I laid out the options as if they belonged to someone else. Clean, unemotional, precise. Option 1 was the quietest. Stay. Continue doing my job with a narrowed scope and reinforced boundaries. Protect myself through documentation and distance. Let the system keep functioning as it always had. This option costs the least in the short term. It preserved stability, income, familiarity. But it required something subtle from me: ongoing tolerance. The kind that doesn't violate your ethics outright, but slowly erodes your self respect. Option 2 was internal escalation. Raise concerns formally. Request audits. Ask for clarification at levels where questions turn political quickly. This path would mark me, even if I were right, even if everything I said could be supported. My identity inside the organization would shift permanently. I would no longer be reliable Anna. I would be difficult Anna, the one who complicated things, the one people avoided looping in. I had watched that transformation happen to others. Option 3 was departure, not dramatic, not reactive, a clean, deliberate exit before circumstances forced my hand. Before my name was tied to outcomes I didn't control. Before integrity became something I had to defend daily instead of simply living. This option carried the highest visible cost: uncertainty, risk, the loss of something I had built quietly over the years. But it also carried something else: finality. I sat with these options longer than I expected. Days passed, meetings happened, work continued. On the surface, nothing changed. Inside, everything had already shifted. What made the decision irreversible wasn't fear, it was alignment. I realized that staying would require me to keep managing the gap between who I was and what was expected of me. Escalating would require me to fight a structure I no longer trusted. Leaving would require courage, but not compromise. So I chose the option that closed the door behind me. Not immediately, not impulsively. I began preparing. I updated my resume carefully, framing my work in ways that reflected what I had actually done, not just what I'd been seen doing. I gathered references quietly. I reviewed my finances, adjusted my expenses, and created a margin. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't threaten, because decisions made in silence tend to hold. When the moment came, and it came sooner than I expected, I was ready to move forward without needing permission. And that, more than anything, was the point of no return. Once the decision was made, everything became very quiet. Not externally. Meetings still happened, emails still flowed, but internally, there was no more debate, no second guessing. The energy that had once gone into tolerating ambiguity was redirected into execution. I moved carefully, methodically. I didn't rush my exit, and I didn't broadcast dissatisfaction. I continued to perform my role exactly as defined. No more, no less. That distinction mattered. I stopped absorbing risk that wasn't formally assigned to me. If a decision wasn't documented, I asked for it in writing. If an instruction was vague, I clarified it publicly, with everyone copied, not to expose anyone, but to anchor reality. I was no longer cushioning the system. At the same time, I took practical steps outside of work. I finalized conversations with potential employers, negotiated terms quietly, chose stability over prestige, alignment over acceleration. Every step was deliberate. What surprised me most was how invisible all of this was to the people around me. They assumed my calm meant compliance, that my professionalism meant permanence. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked what had changed. The absence of noise reassured them. That's the thing about moving in silence. It looks like nothing is happening. I also began transitioning my knowledge, not recklessly, not vindictively, just accurately. I documented processes, shared access, ensured that nothing critical depended solely on me anymore. This wasn't generosity, it was integrity. I wanted to leave without creating harm, even to a system that had quietly failed me. That mattered to me. The final step was timing. I waited until a natural lull, a moment when my departure wouldn't cause immediate disruption, but also wouldn't be ignored. I didn't want drama. I wanted clarity. When I finally submitted my notice, it was brief, professional, unemotional. No accusations, no ultimatums, just a statement of transition. The reaction was muted at first. Surprise but not panic. Gratitude but not curiosity. They still didn't understand what was happening. They would, but not yet. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. At first, my departure was treated like any other transition, a routine inconvenience, a gap to be filled. I was thanked for my professionalism, for my thorough documentation, for making things easy. That phrase stayed with me. What they didn't realize was that I had been making things easy long before I decided to leave. In the weeks after my notice, I watched the system try to adjust without me. Questions surfaced, small at first, clarifications requested, processes that needed interpretation rather than instruction. People reached out politely, then more frequently, then with a hint of urgency. I answered what I could, within reason. I honored the boundaries I had set, but I didn't step back into the role I had already exited. That absence began to register. Clients noticed delays, not dramatic ones, just enough to feel friction. Messages took longer to resolve. Explanations became less cohesive. The calm I had once provided wasn't easily replicated. Inside the company, confusion surfaced in unexpected places. Responsibilities overlapped. Assumptions collided. People realized slowly that certain things had been running smoothly not because they were simple, but because someone had been quietly aligning them. That someone was no longer there. Still, no one said my name. It's difficult to admit dependence after you've underestimated it. Easier to frame the problem as temporary, a learning curve, a transitional phase. But pressure has a way of clarifying reality. I heard later that meetings became longer. Those emails multiplied. Those decisions stalled because no one was sure who should speak to whom or how much to say. What I had removed wasn't just labor, it was coherence. And coherence, once lost, is hard to rebuild quickly. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold, only distance. A calm awareness that consequences don't need witnesses to be real. What they were experiencing wasn't punishment, it was exposure. A system running without its silent stabilizer reveals its true weight, and they were just beginning to feel it. By the time concern turned into urgency, the window for simple fixes had already closed. Not because anyone refused to act, but because the kind of action required no longer fit within the story they told themselves about how things worked. At first, they responded the way organizations often do when something intangible breaks. They added structure. New checklists appeared. Extra meetings were scheduled. Approval chains grew longer. People began copying more names on emails, hoping visibility would replace understanding. On paper, it looked like responsibility. In reality, it was friction. They were trying to solve a human problem with procedural weight. What they didn't realize was that the system hadn't been efficient because it was well designed. It had been efficient because someone, me, had been translating constantly. Context into clarity, ambiguity into reassurance, conflicting expectations into something that looked like alignment. Without that translation, every decision now felt heavier. I started receiving messages that felt different from before. Not urgent requests, not formal inquiries, something softer, more tentative. Hey, hope you're settling in well. Quick question. How would you usually approach this? Just wanted your thoughts, no pressure. They weren't asking for information. They were reaching for familiarity, for the ease that used to exist when I was quietly present. I answered politely, briefly. I offered general guidance where it didn't compromise my boundaries. But I didn't step back into the role of interpreter. I didn't fill in gaps they hadn't learned to articulate yet. That version of me was no longer available. What I could feel, even through text, was confusion, not anger, not blame. Confusion is more unsettling. It's what happens when things stop working and no one can explain why. Deadlines were being met, technically, but with strain. Clients weren't complaining outright, but they were asking more questions. Internal conversations circled the same points repeatedly without resolution. People began to realize that something had been holding all of this together, something they had never named. Eventually, someone asked if I'd consider consulting, just temporarily, just to help them get back on track. They framed it as appreciation, as recognition. But I heard what it really was: an attempt to restore the outcome without examining the cause. They didn't want to revisit the moment when I was asked to lie, or the culture that made that request feel normal, or the assumptions that placed me between truth and convenience. They wanted the calm without the cost. I declined, kindly, without explanation. That's when the tone shifted, not outwardly. No one confronted me. No one expressed frustration directly. Instead, regret began to surface sideways, in reflections, in hypotheticals. We should have documented more. We relied too much on informal processes. Maybe we didn't support her enough. These statements floated through conversations without landing anywhere specific. They were true, but incomplete. An incomplete truth is often more comfortable than full accountability. From the outside, I could see the pattern clearly. They weren't missing me. They were missing the version of the system that had functioned while I absorbed uncertainty, softened contradictions, and protected everyone from the discomfort of precision. And that version couldn't be recreated, because once ambiguity is exposed, it can't be unseen. Once someone refuses to carry it quietly, it doesn't disappear. It spreads. By the time they understood that, it was too late to undo what had been revealed. Not because I left, but because I stopped lying, carefully, politely, consistently, for them and for myself. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't arrive as a collision. It came as an invitation. A message appeared one afternoon from my former manager. Polite, measured. He asked if I'd be open to a conversation. Nothing formal, nothing urgent. Just a chance to talk. The phrasing mattered. It wasn't framed as a meeting. It was framed as closure. I agreed. We chose a public place without discussing why. A cafe halfway between our usual routes. Neutral ground. No offices, no walls with logos or hierarchy embedded in the furniture. When people choose neutrality, it's often because they don't want power to speak for them anymore. He arrived first, stood when I approached. Small gestures, but intentional. We talked about ordinary things at first. Work in general, the industry. Time is passing faster than expected. It took a few minutes before he said what he'd clearly come to say. I've been thinking a lot about when you left, he said. About what we missed. He didn't say you, he said we. That was the first softening. He thanked me. Not quickly, not casually. He listed specifics, projects, clients, moments where my steadiness had mattered more than anyone realized at the time. As he spoke, I could hear something else underneath the gratitude. Surprise. The delayed recognition of dependence. I listened without interrupting, without correcting. I let the words land as they were. Then he paused and said, I didn't realize how much we leaned on you. This time, I didn't nod right away. I waited a second longer than was comfortable, not to create tension, but to let the sentence exist fully in the space between us. Finally, I said, I think a lot of people didn't. He exhaled, not dramatically, just enough to signal that something had shifted. He talked about pressure, about growth targets, about how fast things had been moving. He said, sometimes you make judgment calls and they don't feel that serious in the moment. He never used the word lie. He described it as framing, buffering, and protecting the relationship. I noticed how carefully he avoided the exact language. When he finished, he looked at me, really looked at me, and said, I wish you'd told me how uncomfortable you were. That was the moment when the conversation could have turned, where I could have defended myself, replayed the past, listed every small cut that had led there. I didn't. Instead, I said, I did tell you. I just didn't raise my voice. He frowned slightly, not in disagreement, in recognition. You were always calm, he said. We thought that meant you were okay. I let that sit. Calm doesn't always mean consent, I said. My tone was even, not corrective, just factual. There was a long silence after that, the kind that usually invites justification, or apology, or retreat. None of those came. Instead, he said quietly, we didn't think it was a big deal. And there it was. Not malice, not cruelty, just normalization. I didn't argue with him. There was nothing left to persuade. If he could see it now, he could see it. If he couldn't, no explanation would bridge that gap. I know, I said. That's why I left. He nodded slowly. Not in agreement exactly. More like acceptance of a reality he could no longer rewrite. We finished our coffee, talked briefly about what we were both doing now, the future in abstract terms. When we stood to leave, he thanked me again, this time without qualifiers. There was no apology, no promise to do better, no request for forgiveness. And I didn't need any of that, because confrontation doesn't always require resolution. Sometimes, it's simply the moment when two people stop negotiating the meaning of the past and allow it to be what it was. I walked away without weight, without resentment, without unfinished sentences looping in my mind. Not because everything had been acknowledged, but because I no longer needed it to be. Who I am now isn't built from anger or rebellion. It isn't a corrective swing to the opposite extreme. I didn't become louder, sharper, or more guarded in response to what happened. What changed was quieter than that, and far more stable. I became aligned. I'm still calm, still deliberating, still someone who prefers listening to performing. But I no longer mistake restraint for virtue on its own. I no longer believe that being adaptable means being endlessly absorbent. I understand now that calm can coexist with boundaries, and that clarity doesn't require confrontation to be effective. The most noticeable shift is internal. I trust my early discomfort. I don't wait for it to become defensible or dramatic before I acknowledge it. If something feels misaligned, I name it while it's still small, still correctable, not as an accusation, just as information. That alone has changed everything. Professionally, I occupy space differently. I'm closer to decisions now, not because I demanded authority, but because I made my standards visible. I'm explicit about what I will and won't represent, about how truth travels through my work. When expectations are unclear, I pause the process until they are. It turns out that people respect clarity more than compliance, even if they don't always like it. I don't manage impressions anymore. I don't smooth edges preemptively or translate ambiguity for others unless it's part of a shared, honest process. I let questions surface. I allow friction where it's necessary. I've learned that discomfort isn't always a problem to solve. Sometimes it's a signal that something needs attention. Emotionally, something unexpected happened. Resentment never took root. Once I stopped participating in what didn't align, there was nothing left to resent. No unresolved argument looping in my mind. No version of the past I needed to correct. I didn't win. I didn't expose anyone. I simply exited a dynamic that required me to be smaller than I was. That kind of leaving doesn't create bitterness, it creates space. I've also become more attentive to people, like the person I used to be. The quiet ones, the ones who carry coherence without credit. I notice when calm is being mistaken for consent, when reliability is being used as a justification for silence. And when I have influence, I redistribute it gently. I ask whose voice hasn't been heard. I slow conversations down long enough for precision to enter the room, not as a performance of fairness, but as a correction of habit. I don't see integrity as something heroic anymore. It's not a stand you take once, it's a posture you maintain. Sometimes it looks like a refusal, sometimes it looks like leaving, sometimes it looks like staying, but only under conditions that don't require distortion. There are still costs. There always are. Alignment asks more of you upfront. It narrows your options. It makes some paths unavailable. But those are visible costs, chosen costs, not the quiet erosion that comes from being miscast and slowly disappearing inside a role you never agreed to play. If there's a single truth I carry forward, it's this: you don't need to prove your strength by enduring what compromises you. Quiet doesn't mean weak, calm doesn't mean compliant. And refusal, when it's grounded in clarity, doesn't need volume to be complete. I didn't reinvent myself. I stopped pretending I was less than I knew I was. When people hear this story, they sometimes look for a clear turning point. A sentence I said, a door I slammed, a moment that changed everything. But the truth is less cinematic and more instructive. Nothing changed all at once. What changed was my willingness to continue participating in something that required me to shrink quietly. That's what integrity often looks like in real life. Not a dramatic stand, not public sacrifice, but a series of small refusals that eventually make a certain path impossible to walk anymore. I didn't refuse because I wanted to be seen as ethical. I refused because I understood something clearly in that moment. Once you agree to distort the truth for convenience, you don't control where that distortion stops. It becomes easier the next time, quieter, more reasonable, until one day you look back and realize you've been standing in a place you never meant to reach. Integrity has a cost. That part is true. It can cost you comfort, familiarity, momentum. Sometimes it costs you relationships that only worked when you stayed silent. Sometimes it costs you the version of yourself that knew how to survive by adapting endlessly. But what it gives back is something harder to quantify and harder to replace. It gives you coherence, the ability to move through your life without constantly translating yourself, without managing internal contradictions, without needing to remember which version of the story you told in which room. After I left, nothing miraculous happened. My life didn't suddenly become easier, but it became simpler. Decisions aligned faster. Work felt cleaner. Sleep came without negotiation. I wasn't carrying anything that didn't belong to me anymore. And that's the part people rarely talk about. The real reward of integrity isn't approval, it's lightness. The absence of a quiet, persistent weight you didn't realize you were holding until you set it down. If you're listening to this and thinking about your own situation, your own quiet compromises, your own moments of hesitation, I don't have advice for you, only an observation. Pay attention to the moments when something small asks you to be just a little less precise than you know how to be. Those moments are rarely isolated, they're invitations. You don't have to accept them. You also don't have to announce your refusal. Sometimes, the most powerful choice is simply deciding what you will no longer carry. So I'll leave you with this question, not as a challenge, but as an opening. Have you ever felt the cost of staying quiet and wondered what it might give back if you didn't?
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.